Tweens' first chapter, When We Flew Away, a novel of Anne Frank before the diary, by Alice Hoffman. There's a day you never forget, the day the whole world changes. When you close your eyes, light becomes dark, night never ends, beasts walk freely down the street, stars fall from the sky. You were young 1 second, and then you were far too old. You lived years in minutes and decades in weeks. You wanted to travel, you wanted to grow up, you wanted to be beautiful, you wanted to fall in love. You wanted so much that your heart broke in half, but half a heart is better than none, and your heart is stronger than anyone would guess. You remember everything. You see the leaves turning green on the elm trees along the canals after the spring snow. Songbirds are rising up from the branches, and the bells over the bookstore doors are still ringing. There's a heron sitting on a balcony, a bird that is a sign of good luck. You are wearing 2 sweaters and a coat, though the day is warm. When you see black moths rising from deep underground, you can barely breathe. In this moment, you suddenly realize that you may not always be with the ones you love. Something is happening all around you. This is when you understand that the story can change. Part 1. Little Sister. Amsterdam, May 1940. Once there were 2 sisters. One was beautiful and well-behaved, and one saw the future and stepped inside it. One planted a rose bush, but the other one noticed that every white flower was turning red. One did as she was told, but the other one wrote down everything she had seen. When you write it down, they cannot pretend it never happened. Chapter 1. They were walking home through the river corridor in Amsterdam on the day before everything changed. The sisters were 3 years apart, and at 14 and nearly 11, they were opposites in practically every way. Margot, the older girl, was beautiful, although she didn't seem to know it. The younger girl, Anne, had always been envious of her sister, for Anne might be considered ordinary if you didn't know her. She had light brown eyes and dark hair, and she was always curious, making people laugh and talking nonstop as she entertained her friends in class, even during lessons. All the same, some people found her willful and headstrong. Most people didn't have any idea of who she was deep inside. The sisters sometimes met after their classes to go home together. Margot would make a detour to pick up her sister, then walk her bicycle. It was only 10 minutes' time if they were quick about it, which they rarely were, for the weather was glorious, and today they lingered longer than usual. The world seemed perfect on this day, with bright sunlight falling through the branches of the trees. Why should they rush home to the chores that awaited them? They were young girls, in love with life and with all the possibilities of a wonderful future. It was May, their favorite time of year, the season when the birds returned to nest in the trees along the river and the canals. Only the magpies stayed all year round and managed to survive the cold winters. But now the skies were filled with migrating birds returning from Spain and Morocco. Let's go to the Oas, Anne suggested, their favorite ice cream shop, and if they could, they would have stopped there every day. You know we can't, Margot answered, always the voice of reason. Can't or won't, Anne grinned. Let's break the rules, she often urged her older sister. Let's take a chance. We're already going to be late, Anne said cheerfully. We might as well stop. They had to pass the ice cream shop on their way home from school anyway. Going home meant starting their homework and setting the table and listening to their mother's questions and judgments about how they'd spent their day. Anne loved walking along the streets of their busy neighborhood to the Merwendeplein, the square where they lived, not far from the Amstel River. The neighborhood was filled with bicycles and cars, and the sisters always looked for the flower man, whose cart was pulled by a huge dog. Let's bring him home, Anne said when they spied the enormous white dog who steadfastly towed the cart loaded down with tulips from the flower fields out in the countryside. Margot laughed. He'd take up our whole house. Good, Anne responded. He'd make things interesting. And what do you think our mother's reaction would be? If he sat on a chair, he'd be tossed out the door. The girls laughed at the idea of the gigantic dog being bossed around by their mother. Edith Frank insisted their house be kept neat and clean at all times, and dog hair and muddy paw prints would never be allowed. Their apartment was in a new building in a comfortable neighborhood with many Jewish residents who had fled from the Nazi regime in Germany. There were dozens of new apartment buildings in the neighborhood, including the tallest residential building in Amsterdam, called the Skyscraper. One with so many stories that little children living nearby said the top floor led to heaven. People claimed it was possible to see every star up above if you lived in the highest apartments. In the evenings, when the Frank sisters sat on the steps outside their apartment, they could see lights flickering in the rooms that seemed to float above the tallest trees. If we stop at the Oase, maybe someone will treat us, Anne suggested, for although she had no money of her own, there were often boys who were willing to buy girls ice cream. Anne was young, too young for boys, some might say, but she liked to flirt, and what was the harm in doing so? We shouldn't take gifts from strangers, Margot instructed her little sister. She didn't know where Anne got her nerve, and there were times when she wished that she herself were a bit braver. She couldn't remember ever breaking a rule. Ice cream is not a gift, Anne insisted. It's a necessity, and there's nothing wrong with friendship. Anne, even Margot, easygoing as she was, could get annoyed by her sister's badgering. Not today. Fine, Anne said, walking on ahead of Margot. They weren't friends, only relations, and Anne was certain that she would never have chosen Margot as a friend. They had so very little in common. Don't bother trying to catch me, Anne called over her shoulder as she took off running. Some day you'll wish you had listened to me and had more fun. Sign up for a library card and find this book on Cloud Library using the links below in the description.